Hi, and welcome everybody to the Network 49 meeting. You know where you are, so I don't need to announce that. Thank you for coming. This is a really good turnout. We're really happy to see you here. I just wanted to say thank you, especially to Mike and Emily and Ted. Ted, where are you? For your super hard work for the past, yes, round of applause is in order. For your hard work over the past year working on the consent decree. So just a quick thank you. We'll have a little bit of, we'll have basic introductions and then of course go over our different subcommittee tasks and what we're doing in the upcoming couple of weeks after the presentation. But really we're not here to hear me speak, we're here to hear Sheila speak. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce Ted, who will then introduce Sheila Bedi, our speaker.
Thanks, Natalia. My name is Ted Min. I'm one of the co-chairs of the Safe Communities Task Force for Network 49. Together with Sheila Bedi, we have been spending, I guess it's probably up to thousands of hours at this point over the last year working on this project. And don't want to hold you all from the key highlights. Real quick, Sheila Bedi is a longtime civil rights attorney. She is a professor of law at Northwestern School of Law. She has been one of the attorneys that support communities in our work in a way that, well, let's just say has reinstilled some of my faith in the legal system in this country. And so she's definitely the type of attorney you want to have on your side when you're negotiating simultaneously with the city of Chicago, the state of Illinois, and a federal judge all at the same time. Please join me in welcoming Attorney Sheila Bedi.
Thank you, Ted. I told Ted not to oversell, and he did not listen to me. But I'm really honored and excited to be back with you. I was here about a year ago, maybe a little bit more than a year ago, to talk about the U.S. Department of Justice findings about the Chicago Police Department. And we had a really robust conversation about it then. And I'm back now, not just as a speaker, but as your attorney, as one of the attorneys who represents Network 49. We've got a large legal team. I'll talk about that in a second. But before I get into it, I really do want to give a shout out to Ted and Emily and Michael, and the work that they have done to get us through this process is really tremendous. They have been cornerstones. They have been patient and insightful and brilliant. And when Ted says it is, I mean, it is, we've met probably every Saturday for about 6 or 8 hours since June-ish. So it's been a huge process, and we've had a number of hurdles. And you know, the folks who you have representing your interests have been so dedicated and so brilliant and so willing to kind of build this coalition that we have that is powerful and diverse and that is really rooted in community. So it's been a huge inspiration to me. So I'm really grateful for them and grateful for the opportunity to represent you. And I know I speak for the whole legal team when I say that. So let's get into it. We're talking right now about a federal lawsuit that we filed, and we filed it on behalf of individuals and also organizations who have been subject to police brutality. It's called Campbell v. City of Chicago. Campbell is the name of our named plaintiff, who is a young man who was beaten by the police during one of the protests that happened in the aftermath of the Laquan McDonald video. If any of you saw any coverage of the press conference that happened yesterday, he was one of the speakers. So we filed this case in June, and as I mentioned, we've got a broad coalition. We've got Network 49, obviously. We've got Black Lives Matter Chicago, Justice for Families, which is an offshoot of Black Lives Matter, and it's a group of family members, mostly mothers, whose children have been murdered by the Chicago Police Department. We've got the West Side branch of the NAACP, the Chicago Urban League, Women's All Points Bulletin, which is an organization that really focuses on gendered police violence and the survivors of sexual assault. The Brighton Park Neighborhood Council, which is a predominantly Latino-serving organization, and a number of other individuals, all of whom have been targeted by police violence. So it's a powerful coalition. It's a diverse coalition in terms of background, in terms of geography, and in terms of perspective. And in some ways, that's made this process, I think, richer, more effective, and I think our demands are stronger for that. The case that we filed is something that had never been done before. There's no precedent for this kind of litigation. And that's because in the 90s, the US Supreme Court issued a decision that made it very difficult to file these kinds of cases over the police department. And what I mean by that is that you could sue a police department for damages, for money damages. Happens all the time. It's not easy, but you can do it. It's much more difficult to file a case saying, we're not looking for money. What we're looking for is a court order forcing the police department to do the right thing and to follow the law. That kind of relief is very difficult to get in this context. That kind of relief is very difficult to get through a class action, which is a collective legal process. And also organizational standing, so the standing that you all have to bring this lawsuit is another legal barrier that we have. So when we filed this, we knew we had an uphill battle. And we knew that we had, that we had some political considerations that were very, very complicated, that we also had some legal considerations that made this far from a slam dunk. But there was an imperative to file because it became very clear that the federal government had abdicated its responsibility to protect our civil rights. The federal government was not going to come in and ensure there was a consent decree because of who's in that administration right now. And there was a desperate need for a consent decree, given the findings the Department of Justice came out with last year, and the ongoing violence that we were hearing about. So we knew this was a risk, but because of the strength of our coalition and because something had to change, it was very clear that you had groups this diverse, united in their belief that what Chicago police needed was a federal consent decree. We had to move forward and do it, and we moved very quickly to make it happen because the city of Chicago had released a memorandum of agreement that it was negotiating with the Sessions Justice Department. So a memorandum of agreement is basically a handshake deal in many ways where it can't be enforced in federal court. You can sue for breach of contract. And we were very concerned about what that would look like if Jeff Sessions was involved in overseeing the Chicago Police Department, right? That was something we were trying to avoid. So we moved very quickly to get this thing on file within weeks of the announcement that was in the works. And all of a sudden we heard nothing more about that. So, and the goal here, the kind of articulated goal that all of our clients had was to get a consent decree. But to ensure that consent decree really transforms the Chicago Police Department. So it's not just about collecting data, it's not just about overhauling training, it's about ensuring that the reforms that we push for are going to actually transform the Chicago Police Department. So major hurdles, major aspirations. When we filed, I think we had no idea kind of what we were going to be up against, even though we knew it was going to be bad. The defendants in the lawsuit, sort of who are suing, is the mayor and the superintendent. And what we've done is our complaint is really a history of the abusive practices of the Chicago Police Department. We talk about Fred Hampton, we talk about Burge, we kind of go through the code of silence, and we had to make all those allegations in there because what our real argument was that if there isn't federal oversight, this is going to continue. There's been effort after effort to reform the Chicago Police Department after each scandal. And all of those efforts have been unsuccessful. And that in order to make this sort of political imperative that existed after the Laquan McDonald video became public, in order to make that real, federal oversight was necessary. Now, the reason why federal oversight was necessary is because when there's a consent decree, there is an independent monitor. So somebody who's doesn't belong to either side, who's got the resources of the federal court, who has got broad access to the police department, and who has to file regular reports about the department's compliance with the terms of the decree. So it gives sort of access and transparency beyond any other process. So it was sort of that was the real key thing that we were fighting for. We talk about the pattern and practice in our complaint. We really talk a lot about the code of silence. And that was an important piece here because it's not just that there are, the few bad apples. There is this sort of culture that encourages officers to cover up for each other. and to lie. And that's one of the things that the Department of Justice found explicitly in its report. It used this sort of bureaucratic speak where it said that, I'm trying to remember, it said when officers are confronted with videotaped evidence that contradicts what they wrote in their reports, they are not subject to discipline. Which is like, if when officers don't lie, they get away with it, right? But it was sort of, really something that anybody who's been around the Chicago Police Department knew. And the lack of accountability was, and then the other issues that we really brought up that aren't on this slide are the explicit racism. The use of racial slurs, the ways in which policing in Chicago, like policing everywhere, is inherently racialized. So we knew that this was a case that was very much focused on protecting Black and brown people who are targeted by the Chicago Police Department, but also ensuring that all of us have a police department that adheres to the Constitution and that doesn't have a kind of warrior mentality, a kind of an occupying force mentality. So we filed our lawsuit, and we didn't know how the city was going to respond. We thought there was a slight possibility that the city would say, okay, we'll negotiate a consent decree with you. And the reason why we thought that is because the public message of the city was that there wasn't a consent decree because Trump won the White House. Trump isn't about consent decrees. Jeff Sessions isn't about consent decrees. And Rahm Emanuel didn't have a dance partner. He had nobody who was going to enter into a consent decree with him, and he can't do it himself. So when we filed, one of our messages was, if you're looking to dance, let's dance. We're ready to do that consent decree with you. But Rahm wasn't having it, and the message that he sent back to us was that he was going to fight the case tooth and nail. So we geared ourselves up for a battle. They hired a law firm, an outside law firm, excellent attorneys, but attorneys who know how to fight. And so we were gearing for that battle and trying to figure out kind of what our legal strategy was going to be in order to force the city to the table sooner rather than later. Then what happened next, I think, took us all by surprise, which was that the Attorney General filed a lawsuit seeking the exact same relief that the Campbell case sought, also seeking a consent decree. And when that case was filed, it was filed alongside Rahm Emanuel and Eddie Johnson, and Rahm and Eddie had agreed to negotiate a consent decree with Lisa Madigan. So at this point, the good news was there's going to be a consent decree. The bad news was we were going to be on the outside. Our clients, the communities most affected by police violence, were not going to have a role in that consent decree. So it was a very complicated time as we were sorting through what our options might be, because as much as people wanted a consent decree that isn't real, a consent decree that doesn't result in reform, that's grounded in the experience and expertise of people most affected by police violence, could have been meaningless, could have been worse than no consent decree at all, could have resulted in a monitor sanctioning some of the very abusive practices that we were trying to stop. So that's when we really started strategizing in earnest and thinking about, should we intervene in the Attorney General's lawsuit? What are the kind of legal mechanisms we can use to get in and to try to ensure that our voices are heard and that we would have the ability to be involved in this process moving forward. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. As we are negotiating and strategizing and trying to figure out a way into the Attorney General's litigation, another lawsuit is filed, and that's filed by Communities United and represented by the ACLU. So at this point, we've got 3 pieces of litigation, all of them really looking for the exact same relief, which is a consent decree over the Chicago Police Department. So it became clear that in many ways, because of the pressure the Attorney General put on the city and the fact that the city did not want to fight these cases, that we did have an in. And that in was through an agreement between everybody who's involved in the litigation, the city, the state, the Campbell plaintiffs, and the Communities United plaintiffs, setting forth a process that would allow us to have input into the negotiations of the consent decree, that would allow us to monitor the consent decree moving forward, that would also give us the right to enforce the consent decree if there were any violations. So this is less than what we would have gotten had we won everything and had we been able to draft the consent decree ourselves and pick the monitor. But it was a significant accomplishment because it would guarantee us the right to enforce the consent decree, and it would give us significant input, right? Not as much input as we think we deserve and as we should have had legally, but as I mentioned, there were a lot of risks in moving forward with our litigation. If we move forward with our litigation, we have a, who knows? Judges do what judges do, right? And so it would have been a risk. So, and negotiating this process took months. Do you remember, Ted, how many months the MOA process took? I mean, it was, I think we started negotiating it in August, and we finalized it in March. And it's a 6-page document, right? Like, this is not the 100-page consent decree. But the negotiations were intense, and they were at times fraught, and there were lots of times when we just thought this isn't going to work. We're not going to be able to get this deal done. What the leverage that we had was our ability to intervene in the Attorney General's lawsuit. Neither the city nor the state wanted that to happen. So in exchange for agreeing to having the enforcement rights, the monitoring rights, the ability to have input into the contents of the consent decree, we agreed not to intervene at this time. We agreed not to intervene until we see what the final consent decree looks like. Now, our ability to intervene at that point from a legal matter is going to be somewhat constrained. We haven't totally taken our ability to intervene off the table, but we've said we're not going to do it right now while this process plays out. And the memorandum provides that by September 1st, we expect that by September 1st, we're going to have the consent decree from the city, from the state, that will be developed with input from us and the other plaintiffs, and then will be at the court for approval. So that's kind of the process. That's many months of litigation boiled down into just a few minutes. But while this MOA process is going forward, while we are talking about the consent decree and the contents of the consent decree, our case has stayed. So we're no longer litigating our case. We're focusing on developing remedies and on trying to fix the problems that our case brought up. That's our focus.
We're going to try and adjust the sound up.
Oh, okay. Okay, is that better? Yeah. All right, great. So here's a slide that kind of sketches out the MOA process. And we really just recently, just this week, finished the first stage of that process, which has been to develop what our demands are, to kind of be able to put forward what we think has got to happen in order for the consent decree to be real and to result in transformational change. The next stage is for us to have these meetings with the city and the state and the other plaintiffs, and to get a sense of what are the city and state thinking? What are their priorities? What is this consent decree going to look like? Now, let me say that we have some sense of that because many other jurisdictions have these kinds of consent decrees as a result of police unconstitutional patterns in practice. The Obama Justice Department was very active in this area. Places like Baltimore, Ferguson, Newark, Los Angeles, Albuquerque, New Orleans, a number of places have these exact kind of consent decrees, and their general provisions are pretty much standard. What's different is the specific harms that happen in each jurisdiction. So we have a general sense of what's going into these decrees. We're not entering the process blindly. And what our job was is to ensure that we fashioned remedies that were really Chicago specific and based on the expertise of our clients. Both the city and the state have pledged that there will be a public comment process, so that there will be, beyond just the process that we are in as a result of the agreement, once they put their decree out there, they're going to ask for public comment. They are going to want to hear from the general public, how do people feel about this decree? And when I say the general public, I also mean police officers. I also mean CPD brass. Everyone is going to get a chance to weigh in on this thing. And people's comments on this are going to be used in court to say whether the decree should go forward or not. So that public comment process is going to be critically important to ensuring that we actually have real remedies in the decree. Once the decree is filed with the court, Then we'll begin the process of selecting the monitor. And that's going to be the person who will be in charge of ensuring that the decree is implemented, that the data is captured, that the public has a general sense of what's happening. Those monitors' reports are going to be really valuable pieces of information about what's happening in the CPD. And we don't have a guarantee about this yet, but we have a sense that monitor is generally selected with public input. So that's another place in this process where the public, beyond just the plaintiffs, are going to have real power, real leverage. So then after the monitor is selected, that's when we get to implementation. And it's not like the decree is going to get put in place and then all of a sudden we're going to have a constitutional policing department, right? These things take decades. And it's really about culture change, and that's something that you can't put a time frame on. So progress, even once we get this in place, is going to be very, very slow. It's going to be painstaking. It's going to require overhaul of training, overhaul of policy and procedure, overhaul of data collection. I mean, just kind of down to the minutia of running a police department. It's a huge department. So change is going to be slow, but we're going to be able, if the process works like it should, we'll be able to kind of keep our fingers on the pulse of the change and be able to go into court and to intervene and to enforce if change seems to be at a standstill. So those are the kind of powers we were able to get through the MOA process. So now we'll get to remedies. And these are remedies that we developed. So once we had the MOA done, we then, as a collective, moved into the process of trying to figure out what should our decree look like? What would a transformational community-based consent decree really look like? What are the issues that we want to address? And I've got some infographics up here that kind of touch on our main points. And as I mentioned, the draft consent decree, it's available online. It's 129 pages. It's incredibly detailed. There are these summaries, and these summaries kind of have what we called our 10-point plan, and then some of the really specific and I think most innovative provisions from the decrees. This process was about people, I think, coming with their own lived experience of policing and saying kind of how they wanted a police department to interact in their communities. But it was also very much informed by looking at what worked in other consent decrees, what other provisions were out there, how could we build on those. So it was about kind of what's gone down in Chicago, but also what's happened across the nation when there's been similar efforts to reform the police department. So first one, this is standard in every single consent decree, is a section on the use of force. What are the rules and policies governing when officers can use force? And after doing a lot of workshopping on this language, and I think having a lot of meetings where we were all feeling really frustrated about not being able to get to a consensus, we realized that we weren't trying to draft rules about saying police officers are allowed to shoot when XYZ happens. That's not what we were trying to do, is to provide officers permission to kill. What we were trying to do is to make it clear that officers should not be using force. The officers need to de-escalate. They have to de-escalate. Officers need to have the tools at their disposal in order to avoid force at all costs. Now, everybody understands that there are going to be some situations where force is going to be necessary, given the nature of policing, but that there really has to be a very detailed, specific process that officers are going to have to go through. Because most of the force situations that you look at, there's time for de-escalation, right? There's times for officers to really engage and to think through, can I give this person space? Are there trauma-informed de-escalation tactics I can use before I have to use force? Those types of provisions. So we've written in a number of those, and a lot of those are based on aspects of other decrees that have worked. And we also, everyone recognizes there's going to be exceptions, right? If you have an immediate threat of bodily harm, there is an exception, right? We understand that force is going to be necessary. The other provisions related to force that I think are quite powerful in the decree are provisions related to the rights of survivors, recognizing that even if all of every component of this decree is implemented, there are going to be people who will get hurt by the Chicago Police Department. There will likely be people who will still get killed, unfortunately, by the Chicago Police Department. What rights do they and their families have? Some of the families who are a member of our coalition were telling really harrowing stories about watching the videotapes of the bodies of their loved ones after the Chicago police shot them, and watching police officers high-five each other or manhandle the bodies and put handcuffs on the bodies of their dead children, and sort of in what that made them feel like as they had to watch their child be treated in that way. So we've got a provision that ensures, that requires CPD officers to treat the bodies of people with respect, to treat survivors with respect, to ensure that survivors, family members, next of kin can get accurate information about their loved ones in the event that force happens. We also would require that victims assistance programs are available to people who have been victimized by police officers the same way these programs are available to people who've been victimized by civilians, ensuring that there isn't kind of a hierarchy, and that if a cop has committed a crime against you, you have the right to get to these victims assistance programs. The next section is again, I think, an innovative approach that our coalition came up with. And we hear in the headlines about the police shootings, and those are things that are newsworthy. But the other thing that this consent decree is about is sort of the more mundane, more pedestrian, everyday kind of police violence. The police violence that happens when an officer rolls up on somebody because they think he's drinking in public and slams them against the car. The black eyes that happen because a kid smarted off to an officer. The kinds of things that happen every day in our neighborhoods but don't make the news. Wanting to ensure that we have a strategy for addressing those. And the strategy that we came up with is just reducing police interaction, reducing negative police interaction, ensuring that police know they don't need to roll up on everybody who they suspect on drinking in public. Removing the incentives, the financial incentives that the Chicago police officers have to make an arrest. They quite literally get paid if they're making an arrest at the end of their shift. They're able to get time and a half overtime. There was an Inspector General's audit that documented this, and it was shocking, right? It was absolutely shocking that there's all this undocumented overtime, and that this practice, which is called trolling, is something that's well known throughout the Chicago Police Department, and it's allowed to go unchecked. So making sure that we stop that, but also giving officers tools. The thing is, if all officers have at their disposal is an arrest, if that's the only thing they have to do when they encounter somebody, the likelihood of an arrest, of taking somebody into custody that's going to escalate is very great. But if an officer has the ability to say, hey, there's a 24-hour shelter, let me take you there, right? Or here's, I've got AA sponsors on the line. I could have somebody here in 2 minutes. The giving officers other kinds of tools. It's called a pre-arrest diversion program, and something that's been successful in Seattle and Atlanta would reduce the kind of violence, everyday violence that we see happening in the Chicago Police Department. The other model that's built off a model that's been very successful in Baltimore is a community mediation program. And that will give communities the ability to diffuse conflicts themselves without even having to call the police, allowing a real community-based mediation program to work in many of our communities would ensure that officers aren't called when young people are getting in fights on the way home from school. And even in some instances, some domestic situations can be diffused by these sorts of programs. So building up a real infrastructure of diversion programs that are completely outside of the justice system, with the idea being that that is the most effective way to reduce force, is if we get law enforcement out of the business of kind of addressing mental health, education, community capacity needs. Talked about this one already, the trolling, which every time I think about it, I get outraged. But the idea, $22 million in unaccounted for overtime. Now, we don't know that all of that has gone to trolling, but what we do know is that CPD brass admitted to the Inspector General that this practice happens, and that they had no way to account for it. Absolutely no way to account for it. So I talked about the explicit racism, right? We all know that there's, the disparate impact of CPD's practices is really well known, right? The fact that sort of arrests and policing resources are concentrated in our Black and brown communities. I think that what went unreported when the DOJ report came out was DOJ's findings of really explicit racist language, right? Officers using racial slurs, officers talking about having to go on a safari in the jungle. I mean, really using language that is dehumanizing the people it's supposed to preserve and protect. So we developed a number of remedies that are specific at rooting out bias. First, rooting it out. Looking at officers' social media accounts, right? Sort of doing real screens to identify people who might have these kinds of racist leanings. Ensuring that there is a training that is based in anti-racist principles that forces officers to have to learn about the history of the police department. I know many of you know that our public school students are having to learn about John Burge, that scandal. Their CPD officers should as well. And having to learn about trauma-informed de-escalation techniques, having a really comprehensive community-based training model, but also using data, recognizing that training somebody how not to be a racist is not enough, that you've got to really ensure that it's working, and having a very sophisticated data system so that we'll be able to kind of analyze, every single action the CPD takes for racial bias, and then having a requirement that once it's identified, it's got to be fixed. And there are models for how to do that. It's not something that happens overnight. It's something that is going to require a significant amount of data to work, but it's something that has been effective in other jurisdictions. We also have provisions in there about language access, ensuring that officers are able to speak the language of the communities that they're policing. That was another issue that we heard over and over again, that there were often people who were getting pulled up, were getting roughed up because they just didn't understand the officer's commands. So trying to ensure that the language access issues are dealt with as well. This is one of our graphics about the fact that officers are going to have to learn the history. And actually, it's the history of the scandals. The other thing the family members wanted was the officers to learn about the lives of the people who died as a result of the actions of the Chicago Police Department for the last 10 years. Just ensuring that they had to understand who these people were, that they were loved, that they weren't animals. That was something that was incredibly important to our families. The other issue that went really unreported when the DOJ report came out is the way CPD interacts with women and the ways in which so much of the violence that CPD inflicts on women is deeply gendered and it goes unreported. There's a large amount of sexual violence that also goes unreported. One of the reasons why we know this is because the civilian oversight entity, the sort of independent branch that investigates police officers, doesn't have jurisdiction over sexual abuse complaints. So if you're a man who's gotten beat up by an officer, you can go to COPA, the civilian investigator, and file your complaint. If you're a woman who's been raped, you've got to go to the police department and file your complaint with the Bureau of Internal Affairs. And that now the justification for that is that the civilian investigator doesn't have the expertise to conduct the kind of specialized investigations that need to happen during a sex crime. Now, other civilian entities all over the country have jurisdiction over these kinds of offenses. And I think our response to the fact that if the civilian investigative entity does not have the resources or expertise to conduct investigations into sex crimes, it needs to get them. Right? I mean, the idea that officers should be investigating each other for these types of offenses, it sort of flies in the face of the idea of having an external accountability source. So we've got gender-specific provisions that deal both with the investigation of crimes against women. One of our other provisions about gender is about doing a follow-up with women who are reporting crimes like things like domestic violence, like various kinds of sex crimes. The International Association of Chiefs of Police has done a really rigorous analysis of sort of when does officer sexual misconduct happen, and it's often when people are reporting those types of crimes. So officers are sort of preying on women when they are very vulnerable, and most of the sex scandals that have happened within police departments have happened in the context of reporting those crimes. So we have an affirmative obligation on the independent civilian investigator to do outreach to women who've been victimized, to ensure that the officers treated them with respect, and to find out if anything has gone on that needs to be investigated. Because the other thing that we found by looking into these is that there's often a pattern of abuse and a pattern of exploiting people who are particularly vulnerable. we've got a section specifically on dealing with young people and schools. And this was a section that went through a number of different revisions. We wanted to ensure that officers had training in adolescent brain development, that they knew that when young people are triggered and they run, it's not necessarily because they're trying to hide something, it's because of their intergenerational experience of living with communities that have been occupied by the police, that police officers are often very triggering for young people. But the other thing that the young people involved in the coalition wanted to push for was removing CPD from schools, saying that police officers should not be permanently stationed in schools. That having officers in there and having officers sort of involved in their daily lives and involved in school discipline-related offenses, getting on people because they come to school and they violated dress code or because they're pushing each other in the hallways, that is not an appropriate use of the police. So what we've done is we've got a phase-out program where officers will, after 18 months after the effective date, be removed from CPD schools. Now, that doesn't mean officers can't go into the schools if there's something goes down. But what it does mean is that the idea that the way schools maintain order is through law enforcement has to end. Our young people felt very strongly about that, and for a variety of reasons, including the abuses. But also for our young people who are Latino, the ways in which CPD is identifying people as gang members and then turning that information over to ICE, and the kind of long-term repercussions of the CPD's involvement is something that they were very much aware of. And CPD labeling. So the Police Accountability Task Force, which was a task force that was pulled together by the mayor shortly after the release of the Laquan McDonald video, had a recommendation stating that when anybody is taken into custody, they need to have immediate access to attorneys. That ensuring that you've got that kind of oversight will help cut down on the types of police abuses that have haunted Chicago, both the false confessions, we are the false confession of the world, and also the John Burge-like torture. So that's a recommendation that has been made, that was accepted, that was issued by the city. It really does go into another level of accountability, and it's something that our coalition said has got to happen, both to ensure accountability and also to cut down on uses of force and other kinds of constitutional violations. So we have a number of sections that actually deal with police officers, with things like providing supervision, providing them training, providing them incentives. I mean, we recognize that police officers, so much of the talk around police reform is about punishing officers, finding the bad guys, getting them out. And that's got to be a part of it, right? That absolutely has to be a part of it. But then there's the other part about lifting up the officers who are embracing non-biased policing, who are willing to use these diversion programs, ensuring that they are recognized, ensuring that they are promoted, ensuring that they are evaluated, and ensuring that they become the face of the department, so that it's not, you know, the John Burge and the Guevaras, that we're actually able to lift up officers who embrace this new idea of policing. We also have a number of provisions related to hiring, ensuring that the CPD is reflective of the diversity of Chicago. Transparency. We spent a lot of time working on our transparency measures to require CPD to report all of this data in terms of arrest, in terms of the hiring that they do, in terms of prosecution of officers, just really ensuring that there's a robust data portal so that the public will have the ability to know exactly what's happening with the Chicago Police Department. And that is beyond what the monitor is going to report. So just to ensure, and hopefully institutionalize, so that that kind of freedom of access of information will stay in place beyond the termination of the consent decree. And our hope is that this is going to be different. As I mentioned, we're very much aware that there have been effort after effort to reform the Chicago Police Department, and many of those efforts have moved things forward and then have stalled out. And we're hopeful that this time, one of the reasons why this will be different is because of the ways in which affected communities, because there's been such a broad-based coalition of people who are using the power of the federal court to bolster their organizing and policy making, and using this strategy as a way to hold the department accountable in a way that it can't escape. So what's next? The next stages are really the public feedback stages. And the next stages are really ensuring that the city and the state know what the people want in this decree, that they have a real understanding of what are the critical components, and so that when they go into court, they can say, we were responsive to public feedback. This decree represents, a critical feedback from a critical mass of people from across Chicago. That's going to be something that they're going to want to say. And we would love just to continue to strategize about how we can ensure that the demands that we are put forward are being put forward to the city and state and ultimately the court. And one way to do that is to make sure the city and state know that the demands that we have developed collectively, they've got to be in the consent decree or the consent decree is not real. So I will stop there and take questions.
Where do beat meetings fit into this? Is that something you're suggesting they keep doing, or is it a waste of time and energy and resources?
I think it all, so we tried to find, the question is where do beat meetings play into this? And beat meetings in terms of a way of offering supervision.
Or like accountability and relationship building and all the things they're supposed to do?
So we had a very intentional strategy to not make recommendations about kind of things that like community policing and things like the beat meetings. So those are not in our recommendations, in part because we really wanted to focus on things like the diversion programs. The diversion programs are going to require some community policing collaboration to ensure that they're used. I think the concern with things like the beat meetings is that you'll often hear things like, oh, there's these boys who are playing basketball and they're really loud, and can you get them to stop, right? And so the idea is that we want to move away from policing as kind of the community problem solver and put the power back into the hands of the community. And so our hope is that those diversion programs and the kind of community collaborations they will require would take the place of some of that. In terms of the data reporting, like the ComStat meetings, so when you see officers having to report, or when you see sergeants having to report on crime statistics, that still should happen. But what also should happen is they need to report on use of force. They need to report on arrest rates and on racial disparities in arrest rates, on the use of the diversion programs, so that you're not just getting, there were this many crimes, this many arrests. You're also getting a broader sense of what your officers are doing in your community. I hope, is that responsive? Okay. Yeah.
On the diversity of the police department, I keep reading that the city is trying to diversify the police department more closely match the diversification of the city, but they're unsuccessful in doing that.
Yeah.
Can you comment on that? I mean, it just doesn't seem like something
Yeah.
Can you summarize the question?
Sure. So the question is about the diversity of the police department, sort of how do you get a diverse police department? And there's been reports that the department has made efforts to try to do this, and they've failed. There was just an article about this out, I think, last week. And I don't know the answer to it. And we spent some time kind of trying to brainstorm this within our collective. And what we ended up really punting the solution and saying that the outcome needs to be a police force that is reflective of the diversity of Chicago, and that they need to come up with a plan to change the way they are screening and evaluating recruits. And that plan needs to be approved by the monitor and our coalition, because we don't know enough about what they're doing and what they're not doing at this point. There are a number of provisions like that in the decree, which in order to kind of give you a concrete solution, we'd have to get so much more information where we were sort of outcome driven. I also think that some of the issue is sort of the reputation of the Chicago Police Department and what the Chicago Police Department has done in Black and brown communities for so long. Yeah. Yes.
Hi, I'm Steve Saltzman. I've looked at this real quickly. It really looks fabulous. And what you said in your presentation, you all have done a fabulous job, and we're all really appreciative.
Thank you so much. It means a lot coming from you.
A couple of questions. I see some references in here to giving mental health training to police officers, but I don't see anything about having specific mental health professionals in units. I mean, the LaGreer and the Quan McDonald were classic examples. And my concern is that simply having police take 8 hours of training isn't going to be enough. That you really need somebody who's skilled in dealing with those kinds of issues.
Yeah.
So is that in here?
It is. It is. Yeah, and I think our coalition is right with you. I mean, what we propose is that everybody's got to get the mental health training, right? All officers are going to have interactions with people who live with mental illness, but then there has to be specific resources that are dedicated to dealing with people who are in crisis. And our proposal is that those resources of people to interact with people who are in crisis should be civilian. Should be people who don't have a gun and a badge, but people who really have mental health training, who can do that kind of de-escalation. And so that if you have a family member who's in crisis, you can call 311 and say, I've got a family member who's in crisis. Can you send the behavioral health unit, not a police officer? So that, and people, and actually I think it was really Ted and Emily who pushed very hard to ensure that the behavioral health unit was outside of the police department. Do I have that right?
Yeah, that's a great answer. Second and last question. You mentioned geography in here, and again, I looked at this real quickly, so I'm wanting some more specifics. I mean, many neighborhoods see the Chicago Police Department as an occupying force. One thing that could change that is by having people in various districts. A certain percentage of people have to come from the community they're serving. And I know there's some reference, but I'd like you to elaborate on that.
Yeah, this is another one of the ones where I'm going to have to punt a little, because I think that the concern that the coalition had is exactly that, is that having officers who understand the communities they're policing and who sort of speak the language, literally and figuratively, is incredibly important. But in terms of the best practices for that, and in terms of the data of how well those efforts have worked, there's been other jurisdictions where they've had, buy houses, officers get breaks on buying houses and tax breaks and that kind of thing. We just don't know how well it's worked. So I think it's very much, we wanted to ensure that geography was in there when we're talking about diversity to address those exact issues, that the idea of having somebody who's never set foot in Inglewood policing Inglewood is outrageous. But in terms of how exactly to do it, we wanted to build in some room to be able to figure it out.
Yeah, I'm confused. You didn't talk about it, but in this moving forward, the nuts and bolts stuff, you read in the paper about these dueling proposals by different aldermen about different, ways to move forward, different plans that they have, and how does that fit into this whole? I mean, this is a great plan that we have that we're a part of, and how does that fit into these other alternative visions that are being proposed?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the question is about community oversight and the various community oversight of the police, the various proposals that have been put forward, and how does the consent decree relate to that? So the consent decree has a vision for community oversight in it. And that vision is again one that we have Ted to thank for. He was a big proponent of that, and it requires a democratically elected council that would have significant power to oversee all the civilian investigations, to hire and fire the superintendent. It's a real community-based kind of powerful oversight over the Chicago Police Department. We also have in there standards for investigators, issues about the jurisdiction that civilian investigators will have. The long and the short of it is that the two processes are parallel. They don't really intersect. I think that if City Council makes a move on community oversight before this process is done, it's likely that the consent decree ultimately will end up being silent on community oversight, which I think would be a mistake. I think it would be a missed opportunity. So the provisions that are going forward in City Council really only deal with community oversight. They don't deal with the rest of this. So they are limited. They're critically important, but they're limited in terms of their reach.
That's good.
Yes.
Thank you for the presentation. So can you speak a little bit about the public feedback process? Is this one of those meetings, or just what will it look like?
So the question is, what's the public feedback process gonna look like, and whether this is one of the meetings? And I think that this is the start of one of the meetings. I think that our coalition is really interested in hearing feedback from people about these demands. What do people think? Are they addressing all the issues that folks feel are important? We want to ensure that our demands are truly responsive. In terms of what the feedback process is going to look like for the city and the state, what we anticipate is that they are going to release their decree. They're going to have it available online. They're going to have a kind of let us know what you think, box that you can kind of fill in what it is that you think. And we're hopeful that people will be able to respond and to put in a link to our decree and say, this is what we think. And to the extent that their decree differs, that needs to be addressed. The Attorney General did a significant amount of outreach. There were meetings all over the city, and they compiled a lot of feedback about issues people wanted to see in the decree. I don't know how much of that they're going to do once they release their final product. I do know that they are going to have some kind of feedback process. I assume much of it is going to be online.
To kind of piggyback off of that, I just wonder, what have you thought about in terms of reaching a demographic that doesn't go to meetings? It's great that we have a number of people here, but this does not reflect Rogers Park.
Right. Well, I think that is why we're relying on the strength of our coalition. And I think that we are, or I will speak for myself. I am, the technocrat who can take someone's ideas and write it down. There are brilliant organizers in our coalition who can kind of think through that. And I think I know people are thinking about it. I know people are thinking about it hard. And it's critically important, even to the technocrats.
If I can add real quick
Yeah.
too. You can join the work that our organization is doing and figuring out how to best solicit and include the input from the community. So we were going to save announcements for later, but the Safe Communities Task Force, which is the committee with Network 49 that did a lot of this work, we're working on building a more robust community outreach and engagement facet of our task force, and in the coming months that will include what will greater reaching community engagement meetings look like, how do we host some of these people's assemblies, how do we include high school students. All of that is soon to come, and if you would like to contribute to a more equitable process, please join us. I'll just say a shout out real quick. Our next meeting is May 20th, this Sunday, 4 p.m. at south of the border on Morrison. So we'll start formulating more of these ideas for how to best include more of that community input. Great questions. Please join us in this difficult work. Yes, and the email is on the one-pager for how you can get in contact with us as well. So make sure you get a copy of that before you leave. Thank you.
Yeah, no, I absolutely think that the proposals that you come up with are exactly what we need to do from a certain perspective. But it's going to take a generation to really change the culture of the Chicago Police Department. And we talk about what we're going to do, how we're going to teach police to deal with those people who are mentally ill. I'm not saying every Chicago police officer is mentally ill, but what I see going to CAPS meetings and other forum where police talk about their lives, so many police are very heavily, psychically defended, are very, have a lot of anger, feel like they're under attack, and we need to figure out strategies for dealing with the police and make sure that it's not just a case of how are we going to keep our mentally troubled neighbor from getting shot, but how do we keep the police from shooting people? And how do we calm them down when they arrive? And I really think that for those of us that have done crisis intervention work, we can see police officers who at least think they're in crisis, think they're under attack, think that no one cares about them. And I really wish we had a psychic history of Jason Van Dyke, or I can't remember his name, the police officer who murdered Quintonia LeGrier and Betty Jones, because I think there's something's going on in there that we need to do something about, or more people will be shot, no matter how much training these guys and gals go through. Although I usually just see it with men, frankly. But there is something that we need to take responsibility for that goes beyond a consent decree on this issue, that goes to strategies and community education and talking about this.
Yeah. Did everybody hear that? You know, I'll say that our collaborators at the ACLU have put forward a section of their proposals that has an officer assistance section that really talks about the mental health services that officers need. That is increasingly in the Obama administration, their consent decrees in other jurisdictions had that section for the exact reasons you articulated. The idea that you're not going to be able to stop officers from having the kind of hair trigger unless you deal with their mental health needs, and that trauma is trauma, and that officers live with trauma. So we and the Attorney General also has said that that's going to be a section in her decree where she's going to be dealing with officer assistance when it comes to mental health issues.
I thought it was very powerful when you were talking about the fact of how officers go through training. I had a former student I teach at Malcolm X who went through the officer training, and it was basically like a military basic training. Yeah. And it wasn't a de-escalation type of training. And I thought that was a severe mistake, and so did she.
Yeah. Officers are using the tools they're given.
Right, and I think it's valuable.
Hi, my name is Marisa Graciosa. Thanks for being here and for presenting. My question is, I think I could guess, but I don't know what our AG candidates think about the consent decree and how much the coalition has actually come to them and talked to them about what their leadership might look like after the next election.
That is an excellent question, and I think it is something that is very much in the back of our minds. I know that there was some strategy that the groups were thinking about in terms of engagement, and it seems like really now is the time to sort of figure out where folks are standing. I don't think we've executed any of that at this point, but that really is going to be. I mean, number one, it's one of the reasons why our ability to enforce was so important. Because we are going to be able to kind of, if the the new Attorney General just doesn't want to do anything, we'll have the power to go in. But to a strong Attorney General who wants to enforce this could be a complete game changer for the way this goes down.
It just seems like this is something that will make people want to go out and vote. This is something that's going to motivate our people. And the more we engage in these candidates, the better. So it's something Network 49 can do.
Real briefly, I'm a candidate for Alderman Eva Stroba, and I'm totally on board.
So I have a question, more of a general question for everybody in this room who seems pretty active and activated. What can we do as individuals to get involved? And that's really the next question. Other than individuals submitting comments and organizing our neighbors and our friends to submit comments, what else can be done?
I think writing op-eds. Kind of getting in the media, getting on social media, letting people really know that these are demands that you support, that you're paying attention. I think that there is a real they being the mayor's office and the Attorney General are very much paying attention to kind of the chatter and also what's being reported in the media. So getting kind of a critical mass of people who are going to be talking about these issues, supporting these issues is, I think, incredibly important.
You mentioned that there were 3 different cooperative groups working with. Are they overlapping one another? Is this a problem, or can the 3 different groups work together, creating the same demand?
We are working together to create the same demands, and I think that the groups who work in our coalition, the Campbell Coalition and the Communities United Coalition, have worked very well together. It's been a painstaking process, but to develop demands that are substantially identical.
And just for clarification, that's the 10-point plan that you
Yes.
That is the outcome of that collaboration.
That's exactly right. That's the, now I need to make clear that that the 10-point plan that is sort of Campbell's, your attorney's approach at putting that forward. We're not speaking on behalf of Communities United, but that Communities United have made it clear that they support almost everything that's in that plan.
So is it good that there are different, there's the ACLU pursuit and the Campbell's pursuit? Is this a good thing? Do you see this as healthy that they're?
I think the coalition is really strong, and I think it's diverse, and I think that has ultimately been a good thing. Yeah. Great. All right. Oh.
All right. Well, if there are no further questions, thank you to Attorney Sheila Bedi.
Thank you all. It's really an honor to represent you and to work with your folks. It really is. Thank you so much for having me.